around it. We have a great panel today. First, we have Andrew Borene. Andrew is the Associate Vice President for Research at the National Intelligence University, which I'm told just became part of the ODNI. There he oversees the NIU's Office of Research, and he's had an extensive career in the IC and in the private sector. Next, we have Barbara Alexander. She is the president of the OSINT Foundation, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that promotes open source intelligence tradecraft, elevates the discipline, develops the practitioner community to advance the national security of the United States. She also helped set up the DHS Open Source Enterprise and is a career intelligence officer, including 27 years in the Defense Intelligence Agency. And last but not least, we have Dr. Jason Blessing. He is the Jeane Kirkpatrick Visiting Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on cybersecurity, military cyber forces, and military tech transformation. So with that, let's get into the panel. So Barbara, I want to set the table for our discussion here because OSINT in recent years has come to encompass a very wide variety of things, from sort of traditional OSINT, like reading news reports or monitoring broadcasts, to a wide proliferation of commercially available information and data that sometimes people don't even know they're generating. And so as part of my research, even for doing my book, someone even told me that OSINT is a dated term, that PAI is what people call it now. So let's make sure we're all talking about the same thing here. What is OSINT? What is PAI? What is CSINT, or commercially sourced intelligence? And how do they all interact with one another?
Okay. Well, thank you, Byron, for moderating this. Thank you, Special Operations Association, for co-hosting this with us, and we're thrilled to see you all. The last panel kind of gave the definitions that we use, and I think it's important to recognize that what we talk about, for those of us who are either currently in, have been in, support the intelligence community, open source intelligence has a specific legal definition. And that is, as they read, I'd have to pull out my notes to get it all right, but it's publicly available information that is used in a timely fashion. It has to be legal. It has to abide by the rules of Executive Order 12333 and Privacy Act and other statutes that I know Andrew is able to talk about. But it's used for an intelligence purpose. Publicly available information is information, as Elliot read multiple times, that's available to the public. And we often talk about publicly available information research. The term OSINT is thrown around a lot. I think it's more for convenience than for exactitude. Open source and publicly available information is used by a variety of organizations and entities. It's used in law enforcement. It's used to do commercial due diligence. But if you're truly defining open source intelligence, then you have to abide by that legal definition. Commercially available information, just to remind you, is defined as having a purpose that is non-governmental. So again, those of us who are IC types would not have commercially available intelligence or information as part of the OSINT sphere, although it's closely related. And then you didn't talk about proprietary intelligence, which is even, more circumspect in what it is. That's information that's purchased and is not generally available to the public. So it wouldn't be OSINT either.
Got it. When it comes to the legal authorities that govern access to all these different kind of data streams that are collected. Andrew, do you want to take us through kind of the general rules around collection, what legal authorities are available? I'm told you're a lawyer, so I'm going to give you the hard legal questions.
All right, and for the record, anything I say in this capacity today is in my own opinion based on experience. Need to give the standard lawyer's disclaimer. I'm not in a lawyer role at ODNI or in the government at the moment, so it's especially important that I do this to satisfy the overseers. I'm a lawyer in recovery, 12-step program. It means I'm at that part of the program where I make amends to everybody I hurt in the national security community. So in truth, anything I say here is my own opinion. It does not represent that position of ODNI or any intelligence agency. And just real quick pitch on National Intelligence University. NIU is the intelligence community's sole accredited degree granting organization. We have a lot of alumni in the room who I know. I want to point out Mr. Jardine's here, the first Assistant Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Open Source, who's one of our distinguished alums, who recently was on campus and gave a history in a classified session on OSINT and how the community is going to leverage it. But I also spent some time in a senior role at the National Counterintelligence and Security Center as the Chief Privacy Officer in the function of Civil Liberties, Privacy, and Transparency. So I'll give you a little of my experience and kind of how I interpreted it as I was advising Bill Evanina when he had the job as director. So really, in the constitutional republic, every single American is protected. And when we talk about the government's use of information, the Constitution is really the source that we derive those individual protections from. So the individual American ought to remember that they are protected by all three branches of the U.S. government. It's great that the congressman was here because it demonstrates the first thing I'm going to mention. Article 1 powers. There is congressional oversight in both houses of everything we do in the intelligence community, and all of the authorized money, appropriated money, and subsequent, when we do it with an intelligence agency, it's also going to be overseen by HPSI or CISI in the conduct of the use of information. On the DoD side, and is the Honorable Mr. Miller here? Hey, sir, great to see you. I'm sure that Mr. Miller lived some pain trying to figure out the difference between Title 10 and Title 50 and who gets the oversight approval through the DoD side, but the people are represented by the members of Congress in the House, and those House members get access to see how we use it. To answer to Elliot's earlier point, in order, is for the purpose of a specific intelligence requirement, right? That's kind of what defines OSINT as opposed to government use of information generally. So Congress is heavily involved in this and has oversight. The people are represented in the House and in the Senate. Then Article 2, there is an ODNI function that has transparency into all the individual agencies' use of open source intelligence, whether it's PAI or CAI or emerging use of ChatGPT and social media exploitation. There's also an Inspector General's office at each agency and at the intelligence community level. On the Article 3 side, we talk about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Someone wants to start digging into OSINT for the purposes of an intelligence requirement on a counterintelligence issue, a homeland intelligence investigation. There's also a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that oversees that in the Article 3 branch. So all three branches of our Constitution are heavily involved in how the IC does this in ways that protect the individual American's privacy and civil liberties. I'm going to add a fourth thing. Individual Americans in the intelligence community, whether they are government or contractors, are protected by whistleblower protections. This is just my personal passion point. I'm so frustrated when we see American society, or no offense to you, but people in the press suggesting that leaks had to happen or people wouldn't have found out. It's not true. And I'll name names that I think those Snowden leaks and the Manning leaks we have dead supporters of America because of those leaks. We have lost billions in intelligence community collection platforms because of those leaks. And to suggest that those were whistleblower actions, they weren't. They were violations of federal law, violations of lifelong non-disclosure agreements that they knew what they were getting into. And so I want to be very clear that the whistleblower protections are there so that Americans at large have pathways of representation if something's going wrong. So if somebody's abusing OSINT or abusing the use of access to information on Americans, a colleague can report it to the Inspector General. They can report it to their member of Congress or one of the committees. And so I just wanted to say that there is a very robust set of protections for the individual American that does not exist elsewhere, even in the Western world. And I'm actually very proud to have been part of this intelligence community. And in many ways, our Five Eyes partners come and look to us, and especially our NATO partners, as the example of how do you use these open sources to answer specific classified intelligence questions in ways that protect the individual American. So did that answer your question?
I think so. Let's turn to Jason. You've been focused a lot as kind of an outside expert on the 702 reauthorization. Similarly, there's all sorts of proposals floating around Congress, comprehensive privacy law, proposals to restrict certain categories of data, proposals to restrict what government does with certain categories of data, more transparency efforts. When it comes to the framework for, or the legal framework or the policy framework for collection of U.S. person information in open sources or commercial sources, what should we be thinking about? And what sort of policies, procedures, barriers, legal restrictions do we want put in place on these kind of collection activities?
Well, this is a great follow-up to what Andrew was talking about. You know, you have the intelligence requirement, but what happens when you have the incidental collection of U.S. persons' information when you're collecting on a foreign target, right? And what we've had with the FISA courts, you know, that we have an accelerated way with Section 702 to get out ahead of threats, you know, and avoid a lot of the, and I'll be either as precise or vague as possible since we have a lawyer on the panel.
Not acting as a lawyer. For the record,
Once
sir.
a lawyer, always a lawyer. I think.
But to bypass a lot of red tape for good national security reasons. Now, the problem is that a lot of this is, I mean, yes, you have to go, departments and agencies will go to FISA courts with two things. One is the targeting requirements to make sure, okay, to best extent possible, this is a non-U.S. person located outside of the United States. Cool, but the second thing that we have to consider is the minimization procedures of minimizing how you touch and collect and process U.S. persons' data. And this is, for me, where this is the issue we need to really focus on, you know, going forward when it comes to either commercially available information, publicly available information, or, you know, to try not to throw it around OSINT. And, you know, I think there are a lot of things we can think about. And one that's been in the news recently is the prevalence of warrantless backdoor searches by the FBI. And they've taken, for good reason, they've taken a lot of heat for this because combined they've conducted more backdoor warrantless searches than the rest of you know, anyone associated with the IC combined. So that's a problem, particularly since they're a domestic law enforcement agency. Granted, you could argue they have some counterintelligence reason why that may be needed, but we need to, that's one of the things that we need to really focus on in this issue is limiting access when there isn't, you know, when there isn't necessarily a reason to query the data that's been collected on U.S. persons. You know, along with that is, again, implementing some minimum standards across the agencies. As I understand it right now, for the most part, this is an internally derived mechanism that you come to the courts with. Standardizing and making those, you know, having much stricter requirements with how you handle and the lifespan of for which you keep data, which is another problem. We haven't been deleting the data or destroying data in a lot of cases in accordance with the timelines that we've approved. Part of this is also with a lot of the 702 authorizations that we get, they're blanketly, operations are blanketly done for a year. I think if you reduce that time frame to, let's say, 6-8 months, and then have a reapplication procedure for that, that's another way to cut down on the abuse of this data. You know, I think there are some other good ideas out there in terms of having amici lawyers in the courtroom and having a more consistent presence there. Sort of, to some degree, it's been inconsistent in their presence in the courts and advocating for more contentious or technical issues. And again, you know, I think part of this comes back to auditing and oversight. To sort of circle back to what Andrew was saying is, making sure that, particularly in terms of data destruction, putting in place more auditing procedures to make sure that that's actually happened. It's the fact that a lot of this data is sitting around past the lifespan of the specific operations or mission requirements for which it's been collected, whether intentionally or incidentally. Making sure that we clean house when we need to is certainly an important aspect.
Barbara, you actually, on the front lines, dealt with some of this in helping set up the OSINT enterprise at DHS. In your experience actually sort of standing up a program inside a sort of newish government agency, could you give us kind of an overview of the oversight mechanisms and the kind of protections for civil liberties and privacy that you had to bake in when setting up a new program like that?
Sure, happy to. And you have to bear in mind that my time at DHS Intelligence and Analysis, when I oversaw the collection of all INTs, but particularly OSINT, was some time ago. So I will tell you what we did, and I know that policies and things may have changed since I left government. But we began with an OSINT branch, and the positions had been actually given to us by the ODNI, and they needed to be filled, and these were intelligence open source collectors. So right there is sort of the first activity that I would point out. These weren't all source analysts who were doing open source intelligence gathering as an additional duty. These folks had a specific area of focus, and they did open source intelligence full time. We established a training program. You hear this over and over again, and it's not thrown out to be a panacea. It's absolutely vital, because if an individual is going to do OSINT, they have to understand the authorities and the policies that guide legal open source collection. So they had this as sort of an ongoing effort, and we actually expanded this to some of our component activities as well. But a critical thing is what Jason said, certainly. We had to abide by the 180-day retention policies, and so everyone, not just the open source collectors, but everyone in INA was required to go through their holdings. In those days it was more manual, but today we have tools that can help with retention policies and flag information that has exceeded the purpose for which it was collected. So that was in place. And then finally, and this is kind of important as well, we had a series of reviews and accountability procedures. The open source analysts, first of all, would have to have an approved collection plan. They didn't just go out and gather information willy-nilly. They had to know what they were doing. It had to apply to a specific mission of DHS. And once collected, the open source intelligence reports, the OSIRs, had to go through what we called the Gang of Six. It was the civil rights and civil liberties and intelligence oversight officers, the privacy officer, the general counsel within INA, and the IG. Now, the complexity and the volume of open source information has certainly grown exponentially, and some of these policies may benefit from some improvement and some streamlining. But I think that these activities helped to ensure that the information was being collected and retained and disseminated in accordance with the instructions. And then one other thing I should add is that we had to vet everything through the analytic standards individual as well, which made sure that it was meeting the D&I standards for accuracy and meeting the ICDs, the Intelligence Community Directives, for appropriate use and sourcing of the material. So all of these provide some oversight and accountability from the brand new person to the most senior open source collector.
Andrew, in your first answer, you expressed sort of great faith in the whistleblower procedures and the oversight mechanisms of all three branches of our government. So a follow-up here on the procedures that are baked into intelligence oversight and protection at all levels. I mean, are they effective when it comes to OSINT? Is OSINT abuse overseen as rigorously by the IGs or the oversight committees? And should Americans have confidence that the rules and procedures around minimizing U.S. person data access apply just as strongly in the OSINT, PAI, or commercially sourced intelligence context as in more invasive collection programs?
Yeah, the short answer is yes to the last question. Americans should absolutely have confidence, I think this is my opinion, in how we manage oversight. And it is through that combination of authorizations, appropriations, oversight. Another statute that I didn't mention is the Classified Information Procedures Act. You had mentioned lawyers in the courtroom. Well, if you're a criminal defendant, there's a Classified Information Procedures Act so that your defense counsel can get a clearance, you get a cleared lawyer, both sides. These are long-standing traditions of law and constitutional precedent in America. And I got some hockey buddies in the room from the USA Warriors Wounded Warrior hockey team. Ron Chang, I don't know if Izzy's back there, but one of the things we learn in hockey is you don't skate where the puck is. You skate where the puck is going, right? We fortunately have a very strong constitutional set of protections that are completely nonpartisan for every individual American. And if I could do one thing, I've been inside of this machine of the intelligence community, which is a unique piece of the government, right? So think the intelligence community already gets a great deal of scrutiny. After the Church and Pike committees and the foundation of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, there is so much congressional scrutiny of everything that happens in the Title 50 space and in the Title 10 intelligence space that I think personally, if I were I am an individual American, and I'll speak on my own behalf. I'm frankly more concerned about individual corporate abuse or foreign actor abuse of publicly available information. And I want to kind of reframe and I want to zoom out. I feel like we've kind of been in a very narrow, small bore conversation with 702 and these minimization. I want to zoom out and talk about competition at a strategic level. So, there's a three-way massive competition, and let's name names. The Chinese Communist Party, Putin's kleptocracy, and the United States and our allies. It's a three-way competition. What is the Chinese Communist Party doing with all of this data? Whether it comes from commercially available, publicly available, scrubbed, or because they steal proprietary information from your companies. Raise your hand if you're in the private sector. Everybody's aware that foreign intelligence services are stealing all of your proprietary data and putting it in massive databases, and they don't have a 180-day retention period. They put it in a cloud server, and they keep it forever so that they can gain competitive decision advantage scrubbing all of that data. So what's going to happen after the next massive strategic surprise against the United States that the intelligence community was supposed to have protected our country and our critical infrastructure and our people from? So you have a three-way competition, and I'm asking this is just a rhetorical question. Think about it. In a competitive environment, using those three actors as your example, Chinese Communist Party, Putin's government in Russia, and the United States and our allies, how do we maintain competitive advantage using an exponentially growing volume of data that also adheres to Moore's law with the volume of saving and scrubbing data that now we start overlaying AI/ML tools upon, right? So I just want everybody to think about that, and you as a reporter might want to even think about and ask those types of questions. You know, when something bad happens, if the United States intelligence community had its hands tied, vice its oppositional services in China and Russia, to a lesser degree Iran and North Korea, how are we going to feel after that happens? So I think those are the types of questions, and I actually personally feel very comfortable that the oversight mechanisms are in place and they work. And I think one last comment I want to make is, because the Special Operations Association is here, thank you very much for doing this, SOAA. There's a program called Operation Gallant Phoenix that I used to kind of help take a look at when I was at National Counterterrorism Center. It brings together open source intelligence plus collected exploitable material, which is not the same thing, battlefield chem. And then through a network of partners that are Five Eyes, our closest English-speaking allies, and NATO partners and other partners, they can use that data, and it's easier to share information that's collected OSINT, and again, distinct, but also chem, the collected exploitable material, in ways that they can then prosecute for law enforcement, or give it to the person with the right set of authorities to then prosecute it as an intelligence case, or if something, heaven forbid, has to go kinetic, it can be handed to one of those partner nations so that we can do two really important economic concepts called burden sharing and comparative advantage. So OSINT, as a discipline, as Mr. Jardines used to kind of put out there, is a really helpful tool to make products out of OSINT. You don't have to disclose what the intelligence requirement was, but that product, if it's all derived from OSINT, is more easily and readily shareable with Five Eyes partners, NATO partners, so that we can leverage those two important concepts of comparative advantage and burden sharing, because this three-way competition that we are in for the next couple of decades of American foreign policy is not going to be easy, and we're going to have to do it with foreign partners.
Thank you for giving me an opportunity to plug my book, because I have a whole chapter on Gallant Phoenix in it.
Oh, do you really?
I do. I wish we had met earlier.
SOAA, we should do a separate topic on Gallant Phoenix and his book.
There's a number of proposals, as I mentioned earlier, floating around Congress to sort of take some tools away from government to restrict U.S. government access to certain kinds of commercially available or publicly available information. The one that seems to have the most attention and traction is Senator Wyden's proposal, the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act, that would basically severely restrict government purchase of location data. But there are some other proposals that float around about sensitive site data, like abortion clinics and others. So I guess, generally speaking, I see two sides to this debate, that on the one hand, the government should not be restricted from accessing data streams that the private sector has access to, or that the Chinese Communist Party will buy through a shell company. On the other side of the debate, we do, our government does have unique capabilities, does have a lot of resources, can bring a lot of hurt down on individuals, and we may want to curtail its activities. So, Jason, how should we think about these proposals in Congress to sort of dial back some of this?
So in my attempt to solve the problem for all of DC, I think on the domestic side, at least with the government acquisition of data from the commercial sector, part of the root problem is that, for better or for worse, unlike Europe, we don't have strict data privacy laws or even data ownership laws, which I think you could get much more purchase with, talking about the American people. And we don't have a culture of online privacy that we should have. And that's a societal issue. So a lot of that you just can't change through policy. That's going to be long-term educational issues. But you're also getting to the tension between, this is my way of skirting around the actual question. It's a tension that we've had, and it's not new. It's between individual privacy and, to a certain degree, market imperatives, right? And the market imperative in this point is exactly what Andrew was talking about. It's international competition at the end of the day, right? Yes, we have constitutional protections from acquiring certain types of data, but if it's towards a national security perspective, right, where can you draw the line? And for me, where this gets really interesting is, yes, metadata, but potentially PII, privately personally identifiable information that comes from undertaking cybersecurity remediation efforts, right? You need both the speed and as much information as possible to be able to address an issue that the next solar wins. So it's, I don't think it's an issue of restricting full-on, as I believe the Fourth Amendment is not for sale, bill that's full on restricting certain types of access is not the way to. It's unrealistic. It is from a privacy perspective, it's great, but that's not the only consideration we have. A competition, and particularly from a democratic republic like we are, international security competition has many dimensions, one of which is privacy of its citizens.
So my question would be, why would we want to restrict the government from having access to the same thing that's available publicly? That seems to be short-sighted. And we always have knee-jerk reactions to situations, and the government can't be part of this. So no, I don't think we should restrict the government from accessing publicly available information. But as Jason said, digital hygiene is something that we absolutely have to advance. I oversaw some of the cyber activities at DHS2, and while I am far from being a cyber expert, I learned really quickly, you talk about cyber hygiene and protecting your information online, the just general amount of information that the average citizen puts on Facebook or Instagram or whatever is horrible. And unless you're going to go off the grid altogether, you're going to have some of that floating around in the ether. But increasing education and flagging that for the population to minimize that information is really vital.
So one interesting tension here is I think there's an interesting question about how do you balance informing the public about government exploitation of either open source material or commercially available material with the need to protect the capability. So, to give an example, I basically got interested in this because I did a lot of reporting on ad tech and the buying and selling of mobile phone telemetry data, and the vendors in this space that cater to government agencies did not particularly want to talk about it, and the agencies that buy this data did not particularly want to talk about it, because it was useful to be able to buy large amounts of geolocation data on cell phones without tipping off your adversary that you were doing so. And yet, within the legal framework, at least the one used by a number of agencies, the argument from the lawyers was that this data was opt-in, that it was consensual tracking. So I guess, how do we balance these competing tensions when it comes to OSINT? That often being a little bit sneaky or a little bit quiet about the capability is helpful, and yet we're relying in part on consent as the legal framework. Andrew, do you want to take this one?
I'm going to be careful. So I'm not going to weigh in on any of the legislative questions, and I'm definitely not going to try to make any news. I don't want to show up in the Wall Street Journal tomorrow. But no, in truth, I think I want to back up again and focus on macro issues. And I think what I'm hearing in the question is, how do we manage it so that we don't have problems of the government abusing this type of data? Also, there's an intelligence gain loss question, right? If the government has this capability and then we use it and tell the people we use it, then now it's not a secret anymore. And I think, so I'm going to work and back up a little bit and say the importance of developing tradecraft and a workforce that knows how to do this as a functional discipline of intelligence. And it's funny, I used to be a program manager for America's best loved and most well understood agency. Guess which one it is? It's not 4 letters. But it could be on either side of the river, I'm not gonna tell you. But that program was using open source intelligence for answering intelligence questions and training the workforce. And I think one of the things that I learned in that PM job was, as we trained analysts, there was kind of a heuristic, a bias that if it was open source, it wasn't as valuable as secret. And then I spent some time at IARPA, Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity, working for Director Jason Matheny, who's now at RAND. And Matheny was telling me they actually did a study once, and that there's a 3 to 4 times secrecy heuristic when you do controlled, blind placebo testing of analysts. That if it says TS, SCI, blah, 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 caveats versus unclassified or unmarked, they think it's more reliable. And so this, I think, to get to your point, is I'm kind of less worried. I think the oversight mechanisms are really in a good shape. I think where the investment needs to happen, and we're seeing it, is training a workforce in critical thinking. I talked about the 3-part massive competition we're in. Everybody noticed Russia's doing disinformation, misinformation campaigns, right? So if we're out there taking open source information, how do we train the individual analyst to apply critical thinking and create tools of using accountability and value in what they're reading, right? Don't just take it because it was on the internet, it must be true, right? And so I think that the validation and building trust is really important, and that's a workforce development issue. It's building the individual officer or analyst to really become expert in it. And actually, I'm going to play one other person here. Melissa Stivoletti is in the front row. She's been building a community of practice at Booz Allen Hamilton worldwide for all of Booz Allen, and I think it's great to see it happening in the private sector, and I think we also need to see increasing, and I can't speak to it because I'm not in that functional lane, but an increasing community of interest, community of practice, interagency, right? The Army's doing great things. We just had General Potter over at NIU, and she talked about a lot of great stuff she's doing. And I think that same type of commitment to developing a workforce, to developing, oh my God, doctrine, actually really important pieces like that will go a long way to helping us in that competition of the next 10 to 20 years. Our analysts need to apply better critical thinking than their analysts. Then we start winning the information campaign. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If I could follow up on that really quickly, just to zoom out on what you said, in terms of informing the public, I think it's always a question of revealing sources and methods, right? And if it's publicly available information, I think there is room for greater transparency on the government side to say, okay, we've got a contract with XYZ data broker. This is the type of information that they provide generally to customers, of which we might be and are one. But you do not have to reveal the methods that turn publicly available information into OSINT, because that's the important type of, at least the way that I see it, the tradecraft that Andrew's talking about, that our last panel talked about, in developing the workforce. I think there's potentially room for greater transparency on the acquisition side and the way that we're doing business, but still keep secret and a competitive edge in the way that we're processing that ultimately towards competitive ends.
Barbara, do you have thoughts about this tension between?
Well, I was just going to add, I agree with both my colleagues here, but the whole issue just speaks to the point of the importance of having a professional path for open source officers. Yes. Because too often, agencies across the IC will say, we're going to take somebody who's an all-source analyst and they know how to do, Boolean searches, and so they're going to become an open source specialist. We need to have the investment in developing people who really understand how to go about using OSINT, vetting it, making sure that they understand the difference between, as we used to say, when I was an analyst 100 years ago, the difference between the New York Post and the New York Times, or between News of the World and the International Herald Tribune, and now, of course, it's even more complicated as you look at digital platforms. What is misinformation? What is disinformation? You would never, in a million years, tell an all-source analyst that they ought to do their own SIGINT or HUMINT. So why in the world do we say that they're going to do their own open source? And as we've seen, the volume, the fact that it's 90% of it is in a foreign language. You need to have the contextual. We're off the CRCL issue, but it goes to the properly trained and overseen people who are in the OSINT world are going to go a long way to solving some of these hard intelligence questions that we have to have, and we just need to invest in those. Tools help, but they're not the be-all and end-all. It begins with the people who do the work.
Yeah, so just a quick two-finger. A two finger, that's like the Chatham House Rules thing. Like, I only need 30 seconds. So I just wanted to kind of pile on the importance of the human capital piece and give a vignette. Like, I remember when I was a young intelligence officer reading stories about State Department consular trainees. And in their training, they literally got told, do not look up famous people's names to look at their passport photo, right? And so I think this is where I kind of want to go with this, because guess what? Then there'd be a story, you know, A100, State Department consular kicked out because they looked up Hillary Clinton's passport, or they looked up, Prince's passport picture, after being told don't do that. And so I think it kind of speaks to your point that it is investment in the workforce, investment in making this a functional discipline is how you also safeguard those civil liberties. To bring it back to the core topic, just like human collection. Human collectors go through a lot of training in recruiting assets, managing the recruitment cycle, handling, and then sub-networks to have kind of double verification. We're not paying the wrong people. And I think, again, workforce investment in building up individual capacity in open source intelligence is a discipline akin to SIGINT, MASINT, IMINT, will go a long way also for protecting civil liberties.
Got it. So I think we only have about 10 more minutes. So I think we have time for 1 or 2, maybe 3 questions. So please ask a short, focused, and directed question. And try to speak up, but if we can't hear you, maybe I'll have you step up here. But yes, sir, you in the second row.
I have a question for you, Doctor. Regarding the oversight piece, as you had said, as this thing grows, as more and more intelligence grows and the dissemination of the whole program grows, how is the oversight going to grow exponentially with that? Like you said, we could improve this by more oversight. How would we do that really practically?
Is this in reference to the 702 exception, or in what capacity are we talking about oversight?
I'm talking about the basics of government. Like, I need to hire a lot more people to do this one thing, so we can have more oversight. Will that practically ever happen?
I mean, I'm actually going to fall back onto what Andrew said about at least congressional oversight in terms of House Armed Services Committee and the House Intelligence Select Committee and their cognates in the Senate. Both of them have extremely effective oversight, within their respective committees, and also in terms of communicating between Title 10 and Title 50 authorities. So I see that's not as big of an issue, and I think a prime way to look at that is how is that conversation played out at sort of the highest levels of we're getting out of the OSINT, but it's you need to think about some of the same collection dynamics, the delineation of authority in terms of deconflicting Title 10 and Title 50 in the NSA Cybercom dual hat. That seems to me, that's sort of, a much more secretive model of how oversight has worked for an issue that's, it's a subset of a broader issue of data collection and cybersecurity. So I'm less concerned with the overall oversight that we have, at least in terms of Article 1, but in terms of the Article 3 and judicial aspect, I think there's room for congressional reform for, the specific 702 exception to the FISA courts. And I've kind of laid out some of those, so I apologize if, I was trying to overhaul things altogether.
Thank you for clarifying. I appreciate it.
Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Dave Bacquisino. I'm with the Intelligence and Security Academy. What is the intelligence community doing to develop and socialize a common understanding of how 12333 restrictions on collections against U.S. persons applies to PAI and CAI?
Barbara, do you want to take that, or?
Well, I'm not currently in the IC, so I may be Andrew.
I mean, I guess my answer is there's not a news story in it. It's already infused. It has always been infused. When I was a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps in 2002, it was infused in me that even though there was no OD&I, the intelligence community wasn't really integrated in any kind of purple, meaningful way, but there was actually a duty in the Division G2 shop of oversight and to flag those issues. In fact, I think if anything, my experience, and this is just my experience the past 20 plus years, is I watch analysts and collectors in the United States government get extremely squeamish, and many times they don't even try to go to legal and ask, can I do this activity? They say, touches us pers or U.S. persons, and I'm afraid and I'll run away. And I think, I guess, yeah, my personal observation of 20 plus years as both an intelligence officer and as a lawyer, and also as I'm a certified information systems security professional, so I do know a little bit about cybersecurity, right, is I think the United States in this competition, and as a member of our alliances in many cases, because we respect so rigidly things like EO 12333, signed by President Reagan and every other president since, kind of makes little tweaks to it, that in many ways there may be an unintentional individual officer bias against doing things that are well within the legal bounds of collection and analysis. And then I would finish with another thought on EO 12333 is, in the intelligence cycle, I was taught early on that the most important step in that whole cycle is the use of the intelligence. So open source, big data collection, all of these other things, it's use, and then on the flip side, the EO 12333 or other reasons we have civil liberties privacy officers is to protect the abuse of that. So I think that's the question I would say is it's always been there, and now that technology is advancing in different ways, I think what we need to do is really empower that educated workforce so that they're unafraid to go to the general counsel or to the civil liberties privacy person and ask those questions. May I do this? As opposed to abandoning a mission requirement or answering a question because it said touches U.S. person's data or U.S. company. Does that make sense?
Any other questions? You, sir, in the back.
Hi, I'm Dr. Josh Hugsby. I'm a Blue Horse. I'm a guy who's been in the IC for 30 years, also a military retired, and survivor of the John McCreary School of Intelligence. Those who know him. How do we, and I currently run the OSINT certification program at Graduate Institute Bank. So one of the questions I have is, how do you affect culture change in the IC? Because frankly speaking, my observation has been you have intelligence analyst culture, then you have investigative reporter culture, which everything has to be out. And you have to make them hungry and aggressive, using everything they got to the table to figure out the problem. Whereas analysts have a different culture. How do you make analysts more like investigative reporters? How do we instill that into the community, which is much more important?
Who wants that last jump ball?
You're an investigative reporter. I think you should answer that question. See
well,
what I did there? Yeah, you should do that.
I mean, given that the New York Times used a pattern on someone's countertop to identify them as a potential leaker of classified information, it's pretty clear that intelligence officers are not the only ones that can do OSINT. I even saw some wag on Twitter joke that that case up in Massachusetts was cracked by, wait for it, counterintelligence. Tough for him. All right. In any case, I don't have tremendous thoughts on the culture within the IC, but I always advocate thinking like a reporter. So.
Yeah, I mean, just to put a pin in that and sort of harken back to the question that Andrew just had, it's an issue of professionalization of the workforce. And, we talk a lot about, zoom out more broadly, and particularly in our democracy, our military, one of the reasons they don't violate civil liberties is because of military professionalization. That's not the only reason, but that's an important part. And developing, something similar, at least in specific as a discipline as OSINT, I think that is, an important way forward to protect civil liberties, maintain an investigative mindset, but that professionalism doesn't take it to the nth degree.